Thanks. Greg McMaster, Postal Workers. And when David mentioned that he was the editor of the Varsity at U of T, I finally realized where I remember your name from. And I met a number of people here know my life partner, Andrea Waylenko, was the layout editor at the Varsity. I met her a little bit after David, and there was other famous leftists that were editor of the Varsity at that time as well, like Tom Walcom later on, and Linda McQuaig. And we all worked, I came along a little bit later than David, I think, but, and I think the student press and the Varsity in particular played a role in linking the New Left to the labor movement, partly through the Waffle and the NDP as well, because, inside and outside the NDP actually at the time, because the student press started covering labor struggles that you wouldn't read about in the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail. And there was a number of ferocious labor battles that went on in Southern Ontario during those years, and they kind of physically provided a link with the labor movement for leftists, but also the student press provided a voice for a lot of those activists, and people like David and so on were involved in that. And I remember also, I guess it was the, you mentioned, or somebody mentioned the War Measures Act. The Varsity printed, or tried to print the FLQ manifesto in the center spread. And my partner Andrea now was the layout editor, so it often fell to her to drive it miles and miles out to the suburbs to the printer, and like 3 in the morning or whatever when it was done. So she got out there that night, and the RCMP were there. So guess what? There was 2 blank pages in the Varsity that came out that day. So that's a story I remember.
Kind of funny because we did take it to the print shop that Thursday evening and got it into print, and it did come out. But of course, the War Measures Act was declared at 4 a.m. So by the time the paper had come out, it was illegal to have published it. There were some subsequent manifestos that came out that same fall, which did result in blank space in the newspaper pages. But Greg's point is correct that the Varsity did see itself as a kind of, I think we used to bill ourselves as Toronto's second largest morning newspaper, and we did try to address larger issues. It was a 3 times a week newspaper, so it did have a pretty substantial space available. And it does reflect, when you look back at it, it does reflect that. If you did a little content analysis, you would see analysis of some of those strike situations, the Dunlop situation, the emergence of criticism of the mainstream of the labor movement, the rise of Canadian unionism, and so on. And you see it also in the pages in the reviews section. And you can pass over the reviews by Bob Ray and Michael Ignatieff if you like, although they are interesting because of some of the things they say about Pierre Trudeau and so on in those pages. But you can also find reviews of books on the Wobblies and other things in labor history that we were just discovering at the time. Because one of the things that was attractive about doing labor history was we felt that there was a way there to tell a human drama, to restore some narrative drive to the kind of more institutional, almost exclusively institutional labor history that we had been reading in Canada. Bryan made excellent points, of course, in pointing out how we were redefining the field as labor and working class history. But even that was not enough. And I sort of implied it initially that, and Bryan captures it by saying how successful we were. We were partly successful because there was so much need for the kind of new perspective we were bringing to Canadian history. So Linda is a good example of somebody who became involved in doing many kinds of history in addition to labor history. And the same thing happened to me, of course, when I ended up spending my career in the Maritimes. Was I became a regional historian and was for many years editor of the Journal of Regional History, Acadiensis. And so we were filling a void there, and there was a certain level of frustration because A number of us were hired as labor historians and then ended up with very little opportunity to teach in the field. Did a lot of graduate supervision in the field, but a lot of our teaching actually tended to be in the mainstream of Canadian history, and in my case, more in regional history. So I think that there was a great need for new people, and there wasn't a lot of hiring going on, so a lot of burdens fell on a few shoulders. Thank you.
There were a couple of commentators in the back.
Thank you. Wayne Stoper with UNA. Historically, the NDP has been more favorable to Labour than, of course, our progressive government here. Do you feel, and I'll direct this at anybody that wants to take it, that with the momentum that the NDP has had of late, that there is any advantages or disadvantages of them getting a more of a momentum in Alberta? Thank you.
I'll take it and then Palmer can criticize me. Given the state of the world and the state of Canada and the state of Alberta, it seems to me that anything that is to the left of what currently governs is preferable to what's in power. Having said that, I think it's also important to realize that NDP governments in provincial contexts in Canada do not deliver everything that the labor movement or social movements would desire. So support the NDP, yes. Support them critically, even more so. Try to keep the pressure on them to do the right thing, which many of them are inclined to do, at least when they're not in power. But I think it's important not to delude ourselves that the victory of an NDP government would lead to the kind of social transformation that I suspect most of us in this room would desire. And the experience of social democracy in other parts of the world would suggest the same thing, I think. British Labour being probably the prime example at the moment. But again, having said that, better than Wild Rose.
Well, on the face of it, that's a hard argument to argue against. And in fact, I won't argue against it too much. But what I also think is absolutely critical for Labour and the left to address is where the political spectrum is at any given moment. In our times, and it's not just Alberta, the political spectrum has shifted so far to the right, and all the mainstream parties have moved in that direction, that it's very difficult to expect that you're going to get, as Greg said, very much from an NDP government. And we saw what happened when we had an NDP government in Ontario in the 90s, where Bob Rae, who now heads the Liberal Party, headed an NDP government, which essentially tore up union contracts and imposed so-called social contract in the midst of austerity. I can understand why people would vote strategically, why they're discussing and debating in the context of right-wing governments that are threatening to all that all of us would support, why they would consider voting for particular political parties in the current moment. What I think is absolutely necessary to also address, however, and I will be closing for a bit on this note later today, is for the labor movement to actually develop independent vehicles of political action. And that for the labor movement and for the left, which after all, we've been talking mainly about the labor movement and trade unions here, but trade unions and the labor movement advanced because of the left. And trade unions and the labor movement have faltered over the last decades in tandem, because the forces that have been, moving against them, are very complicated and related. But the left has never been weaker, and the left needs to be much stronger so that trade unions can be stronger. And I think it would be a mistake to put all of one's eggs in an electoral basket composed of a left that's conceived of as the NDP.
Well, I don't think I'll have anything.
Yeah, well, James said I should probably put something on the record. My background is in some ways kind of similar to David Frank's. I was the editor of a student newspaper as well, the Manitoban at the University of Manitoba. And I had thought I would be a journalist, and then I was blacklisted. So, because I'd been so involved in student politics and student journalism, I had a very mediocre undergraduate degree in English. Anyway, so I worked for a year as assistant editor of Canadian Dimension magazine. And during that period, actually, I almost became involved in labor history. The Penner brothers, Roland Penner and Norman Penner, wanted to hire me to do a history of the labor movement in North Winnipeg, which is where I grew up. And, I was well connected with both communist and CCF NDP labor people and seemed a natural person to do it. But they were hoping to get their money from York University and the Canada Council, and they got not nary a penny. So, and I was a working class kid, I couldn't afford to do it for free. So, and then I actually hoped, though, to do some of that stuff for my PhD, but I never actually thought of going to an American university. I went to the University of Toronto, and my supervisor was Ken McNaught, who was an enemy of the new social history and that, and he didn't think that the proposal made any sense, so I did something else. And then later got involved in labor history stuff when I had come to Alberta and was doing work on social credit, and also tried to deal with a question that I still tried to deal with, which is how is it that Alberta, which started off with so much labor politics and so much labor working class consciousness, ended up as this extremely right-wing province where labor is always on the defensive. So that's my little bit.
Name is John Kavanaugh. I'm with the Dandelions, or the old Dandelions, new Dandelions. I learned a lesson back in the 80s that what you guys just said, you can't really trust a politician. They start lying the moment they open their mouth. So the only way is yourself. Demonstrations, boycotts of stuff that the employer, identify who the employer is and who the enemy is. It's very easy to identify the enemy. It's the energy sector of the province. That's our enemy, the working man, because they control the Conservative Party, and anybody thinks they didn't. Where did Lougheed and where did Don Getty go after they got out of politics? Imperial Oil. Who runs the Conservative Party in Alberta? Isn't it the guy down there in Alberta, Sutherland, and a few of those guys? That's the enemy. Demonstrate in their places. Embarrass them. You don't have to be violent. You just have to be there in numbers, large numbers. Threaten to boycott their products. Maybe even quit paying for TransAlta power rates and stuff. Just civil disobedience. That's the only way. That's the political thing that answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Jeff Taylor. I just want to pull out a thread that both Greg and Bryan touched on. And the role, one of the roles of the new working class in labor history in the 1970s was to, as you've indicated, to kind of challenge the what I think can be described as conservative traditions in historiography, but also I think was part of a kind of broader challenge to the academy, certainly in the humanities and social sciences more generally, of a conservative tendency. So as part of that, certainly in history, labor and working class history became dominant, or certainly became a major strand. And also in political science, in economics, sociology, labor became important. More broadly, from the 70s to the present, you've had I think it's fair to say, in the humanities and social sciences, a kind of radicalization where you look at a faculty of arts today in the universities, and it's generally radical, progressive in a way you couldn't describe it as in the 50s and the 60s. But there's an irony or contradiction in that certainly labor history, but also more broadly in political science and economics and so forth and sociology, you don't see much labor being done anymore. So you've got an academy that's progressive, radical in some ways. Most people in those disciplines, I think, would describe themselves as such, but they're doing other things. And certainly from looking at this from a perspective as a socialist, you'd think that labor and working class considerations would be at the heart of a radical project. So do you want to comment on that?
Don't fight for it.
Somebody else.
Well, one way is to say that in some senses that's what I was trying to suggest when I say we failed also, is that we failed to sustain a political project in which the analytical foundations that drove our concern with issues of culture and with trying to look at things in a different kind of way, and to put working class people at the center of a project of historical analysis. And I think that there are many reasons why the trend that you suggest is going on, which I think I agree with largely, has in fact happened. And why, and Greg touched on this, why labor history outside of charm circles such as ourselves is perhaps not the centerpiece of intellectual work that in some senses it could be have envisioned to be as the 70s went into the 80s. A whole series of things happened that made the study of class and the analysis of class more and more, I won't say difficult to sustain, but more and more marginal compared to what it had been. I mean, one is essentially the terms of trade in global economic life, and which turned very much against the trade unions and against working class people. One is I'm very convinced it relates to intellectual currents in the university that related to that and that related to the fall of the Soviet Union and the implosion of Stalinism or actually existing socialism. Many leftists who would have embraced Marxist analyses in the late 60s and 70s turned towards postmodern kind of interpretations which displaced materiality, class analysis, etc. That has somewhat run its course, but I think we still exist with the hangover of that, with the residue of that. And many people got hired in universities who went through that. So the project really is to, I think, to stay a particular kind of course, but be attentive to new intellectual trends and developments. To, again, not to narrow one's politics, and I agree with my friend in the Dandelions, but to be willing to engage in extra-parliamentary kind of activity, to engage in demonstrations and protests. And again, a session on the Dandelions I thought was very instructive this morning because of the sense that the people who went through that movement had of the necessity of actually changing what the labor movement is about. I mean, a very concrete instance right now is, what should the labor movement be doing in terms of Quebec, where these students are in the streets and have been in the streets for months and fighting a fight that's very much congruent with what the labor movement has always been about? Well, the labor movement has been there, but in my judgment, not in a strong enough way. It should, and this relates to a question that came up in the Dandelions session from the audience. How do we involve youth and educate them in what the labor movement is? Well, it's one way to do it in terms of conceiving of youth as members. It's another way to do it to say, we have common cause with you. We are actually as one with you. We are going to be in the streets with you. We have more power than you, and we are going to use that power to support, the dispossessed in a very broad sense of the terms. And all of that is, I think, a way that this will come back, and the project sort of won't wither on the vine.
We've got one more comment from the audience, and then I think we'll move things to Logan to have offer up some reflections on.
Yeah, my name's Peggy Morton again. I want to make just some observations about how labor history is often presented to workers. And perhaps, if anybody on the panel wants to comment, my interest is the question of what is it that labor historians need to be doing now to contribute to workers themselves putting themselves at the center. Because I don't think we're in the same paradigm that you can talk about in the 70s, when a lot of us as youth and student activists joined the working class movement and became activists there, became organizers. We're in a situation now where the working class has to constitute itself as that leading force in the society. And I think that there's a real gap in how labor history is presented to workers, which will help them deal with the problem, the concrete problem we're facing right now. And so part of that is that history is presented as nostalgia. Wasn't it great back then when we were engaged in all these fights, as opposed to now when we're getting the shit kicked out of us on a regular basis? Interestingly enough, nostalgia is not always just about the working class movement, but it's also about the forces. For example, there's all sorts of nostalgia which is presented about the Lougheed era in Alberta, as though the Lougheed era was some bloody Camelot era when everybody was just happy as hell. And it's very helpful, I think, that we brought out the Dandelion movement and some of the fights of the public sector, because, as a hospital worker, that's when we became criminalized, during the Lougheed era. It wasn't during the Klein era. It was when the huge assault on the working class movement in construction began. It was during the Lougheed era. It was when they first organized the special projects, which is what they used to install clack in the tar sands. That was during the Lougheed era. And so then we have all this nostalgia. Well, shouldn't we just do things the way Lougheed did them? And so I think that we have a real gap in how labor history is presented, so that we don't value the resistance which does exist now. Like, I don't hear anybody getting excited, and I'm just as excited, or more excited, about the workers on that Hardisty picket line, who are just full of fight and determination, and who speak so eloquently about, their defense of the seniors and why, public health, private health care should be abolished and all this. And sometimes we only have that excitement about some nostalgic fight that took place in the past. At the same time, I know I'm taking up all the time, so I'll say one more thing. At the same time, we don't present things from the point of view of what is the particular problem we're facing now. And Bryan has come and spoken on this numerous times, and I think it's a conversation we keep needing to have, which is that we've come to the end of that period that began with the post-war labor arrangements, and what does that mean? And I think labor historians really have a role to play in situating that so that workers can look reality in the face and say, okay, that old period, it's dead, it's finished. We're still stuck with its labor law and its relations and that way of organizing, but it's finished because there's no longer any labor peace in Canada which recognizes that workers have any rights at all. Think about it. There's a case going to the Supreme Court which says you don't have a right to photograph a scab because a scab has an intrinsic right to privacy. And so every single thing which, was second nature to us, they're trying to finish. And so, I think I didn't give you any time to answer, but that's my observations on labor history. Maybe we can continue the conversation some other time.
I guess we'll just have David speak to it very briefly, and then we'll have Logan get up and tell us.
I'll speak to that briefly because I think you've really pointed out the importance of our getting involved in participating in the needs of the labor movement. And in a sense, that was my experience in coming into labor education, which I may have had more experience than others in this group in doing. And I was invited regularly to do presentations to labor councils and to the Atlantic Region Labor Education Center and other groups upon becoming the only practicing labor historian in New Brunswick in the 1980s. And what I found there was that there was a real demand on the part of activists, and this is not your general run of workers, but the activist participants, to understand where we are in terms of history, because they did know that they were not in the same period that the labor historians had been writing about when they wrote about the Knights of Labor, they wrote about the Winnipeg General Strike, or even when they wrote about the post-war settlement. They knew from the mid-1970s onward that something was changing. And we often teach a kind of labor history that ends with that post-war settlement. But they understood that they were in a new era. And so what we were trying to achieve in that labor education process was to assist workers in seeing themselves historically, to seeing themselves within history as facing a new set of challenges. But in looking back at the history, they could identify the modes of resistance, the sources of solidarity that do exist at any time within the working class. So I think that was, so the recommendation I would make to fellow scholars and researchers is to be available and to participate. If you want to see some of these debates in action, go to your Federation of Labor meetings, go to your Labor Council, respond to these opportunities to demonstrate what skills and experience you can bring to the story, and you will be asked to do more if you seem to be able to assist. So a lot of what I've had to do, I think, and I applied this in talking about getting involved in New Brunswick labor history, which I would never have done if I hadn't been paid by the taxpayers of the province, is to respond to a felt need within the province, to place some expertise at the disposal of the working class movement. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I've been asked to respond to the panel in this session as a current graduate student. So, I think, although the focus of the panel has been biographical in part, I think Eric's framing questions and the tenor of the discussion are very much oriented around the contemporary and future relevance of labor history. And so, from my own stance as kind of at the beginning of embarking on a professional career in historiography, I'll start from there and speak to the couple of reflections stimulated by the question of contemporary relevance. So number one, we've heard repeatedly, and I think would all assume, labor history has been consistently related to and stimulated by questions about resistance and protest. And of course, we've seen in the biographical examples that labor history has also been a means of carrying forward critical impulses that have their roots elsewhere or outside of academic settings. And some of the panelists have touched a little bit on, the current context of protest in Quebec and the Occupy movement earlier this year and elsewhere. And so I think it's quite clear to us that the questions about resistance, protest, dynamics of solidarity, et cetera, asked by labor history are still acutely relevant. And it's clear that that kind of activism has a potential to shape a research agenda going forward. I think the challenge that some of the panelists have laid before us as historians going forward is, and I think is maybe in part at the root of Bryan's comments about some of the failure of labor history to take hold in some of the ways that may have been anticipated. There's a challenge to reinsert labor history in particular at the center of these contemporary questions about protest and resistance that are asking some of the same questions that these labor historians were or have been asking since the 1960s. Secondly, and I think this has been touched on implicitly by some of the panel, we know that certainly there's a strong move in historiography, and I think also in public historical consciousness to understand Canadian history, I think particularly the 20th century Canadian history, in a global context. And so, that's manifested in various different ways, but in part it's about understanding the legacy of imperialism and colonialism in Canada and the relationship of those factors to racial inequality, to Indigenous history and dispossession, et cetera. And I think we've heard that some of those kinds of interests have, in a sense, displaced some of the interest in or capacity to engage in labor history. So some of the individuals or constituencies that may previously have been particularly invested in labor history have turned to other questions. But nevertheless, I think some of what's most interesting about that kind of work is the challenge of understanding the relationship between broad processes of historical change, modernization, economy and global capitalism, urbanization, and I think, and Greg touched on in his early comments about the importance of the 1960s and the kind of broad dynamics in which new labor history initially articulated its place. And I think that there's, perhaps a similar challenge and an opportunity here for labor history to re-articulate its relevance to those kind of broad processes of change on a global scale. And it's, I think that's not a discouraging point for labor history, but I think it's an opportunity to re-engage with new and emerging kinds of historiography that do have significant political purchase in Canada. And then thirdly, and this is something that I don't think has been addressed directly in the discussion, but I think it's been implicit in a number of the comments about sort of the place of labor history in arts faculties and history departments and institutional contexts. As a so-called crisis in the humanities, and so we talk about the political and funding institutional challenges to arts faculties across the country, but I think particularly disciplines like history and English literature, et cetera, fine arts and humanities that are certainly I think are facing unique challenges. And I think, certainly that's not reducible to the same kind of political forces that are currently working to suppress unionism and labor politics. But they certainly belong to the same array of political and economic forces. And labor history is no antidote to those challenges. But, if we are confronting, we as humanities scholars, historians in general, labor historians, organized labor, if we're confronting an array of political and economic challenges that do share something in common, that I think that there is a common impetus for us to respond collectively, perhaps not in unified or coordinated ways, but to respond collectively. And so I think, if there's a challenge that I take from this session as a young historian in the room is to figure out how to start aligning these various interests in response to that array of forces that is challenging, I think, the sustainability of all of our places in this room. And if we can't, I think, as a next generation of historians begin to address that, we may be in a place where labor history has lost its institutional purchase altogether, much as academic historiography in general is, I think, coming under threat. So, I think this panel's left us with some important opportunities and lessons about how we might go about starting to articulate ourselves in that context. But I think that that's the key challenge going forward. Maybe I'll stop there.
So please join me in thanking once again all 5 of our panelists, including Logan, and yourselves too. And that'll close the session.